The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound in Afghanistan as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his tactical vest one final time. His SEAL team had been preparing for this mission for weeks, and everything had to be perfect. The intelligence was solid, the target confirmed, and the extraction route mapped down to the second. What they didn't know was that their entire operation had been compromised by someone they'd never heard of. 3,000 miles away in a cramped apartment in Detroit, Lena Gray stared at her computer screen with bloodshot eyes. She hadn't slept in 36 hours, surviving on nothing but coffee and determination. The 28-year-old former Army intelligence analyst had stumbled upon something that made her stomach turn. Hidden deep within encrypted military communications, she had discovered a pattern that no one else seemed to notice. Lena's fingers trembled as she scrolled through the data one more time. Communication timestamps, mission coordinates, and personnel assignments all pointed to the same terrifying conclusion. Someone with high-level security clearance was selling American military operations to enemy forces. The evidence was buried so deep that it had taken her months of careful analysis to piece it together, working entirely on her own time with equipment she technically wasn't supposed to have. Back in Afghanistan, Morrison's team moved through the pre-dawn darkness with practiced silence. They had done this dance hundreds of times before. 8 elite warriors, each one a master of their craft, approaching what they believed was a routine extraction of a high-value target. The compound ahead looked exactly as their briefings had described. Too exactly, though none of them realized it yet. Lena knew she had to act fast. According to the intercepted communications she had decoded, a SEAL team was walking into what could only be described as a carefully orchestrated ambush. The enemy wasn't just waiting for them. They knew the exact time, approach route, and even the team's extraction plan. Whoever was feeding information to the other side had provided enough detail to turn what should have been a successful mission into a potential massacre. The problem was that Lena Gray officially didn't exist in any system that mattered. After her discharge from the Army following a classified incident that had left her with a damaged reputation and no official standing, she had become a ghost in the intelligence community. Her warnings would likely be dismissed as the ravings of a disgraced former analyst with an axe to grind. Even worse, trying to contact anyone through official channels would take hours or days, time that Morrison's team simply didn't have. Morrison signaled his team to halt as they reached the outer perimeter of the compound. Something felt wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The silence was too complete, the shadows too perfect. His instincts, honed by years of combat experience, were screaming at him to abort the mission. But the intelligence had been confirmed by multiple sources, and his commanding officers had been adamant that this target was critical to ongoing operations in the region. In her Detroit apartment, Lena made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't go through official channels, but she had other options. During her time in Army intelligence, she had made connections with people who operated in the gray areas between legal and necessary. One of those connections was Marcus Chen, a former CIA operative who now worked as a private contractor. If anyone could get a message to the right people quickly, it would be Marcus. Lena's hands flew across the keyboard as she composed a message that contained just enough classified information to prove she was legitimate, while avoiding anything that could be traced back to her. Illegal access to military communications. She included the mission coordinates, the team designation, and most importantly, a warning that their operational security had been completely compromised. She hit send and immediately began covering her digital tracks. The message reached Marcus within minutes, but even he was skeptical. Lena Gray was supposed to be out of the game permanently, her security clearance revoked and her credibility destroyed. But Marcus had worked with Lena before, and he knew that her analytical skills were among the best he had ever encountered. If she said a SEAL team was in danger, he wasn't going to take any chances. Morrison's team was now within 50 meters of the compound when his communications specialist received an encrypted message on a frequency that wasn't supposed to exist. The message was brief and anonymous, but it contained information that only someone with intimate knowledge of their mission could possibly know. More disturbing was the warning that their entire operation had been compromised and that they were walking into a trap. The team leader faced an impossible choice: abort a mission based on an anonymous warning from an unknown source, or continue with an operation that had been planned and approved at the highest levels. His training told him to trust the chain of command and the intelligence apparatus that had brought them this far. His instincts told him that something was very wrong. As Morrison weighed his options, Lena was already working on her next move. She had managed to get a warning to the SEAL team, but that was only the beginning. The real threat was still out there. Someone with access to the most sensitive military communications who was systematically betraying American forces. Finding and stopping this traitor would require resources and access that she no longer officially possessed. The clock was ticking for everyone involved. Morrison had seconds to decide whether to trust an anonymous warning or his official briefing. Lena had to find a way to prove her accusations without revealing her illegal access to classified systems. And somewhere in the intelligence community, a traitor was watching and waiting to see whether their carefully laid plans would succeed or whether this mysterious Lena Gray would somehow manage to throw a wrench into their operations. The bullet that would change everything was already loaded in a sniper's rifle, waiting in the darkness of the Afghan compound. The moment that would bring Lena Gray back into the light was about to arrive, whether she was ready for it or not. Morrison's finger hovered over his radio as he prepared to make the most important decision of his military career. Morrison's decision came down to a single moment of clarity. 20 years of military service had taught him to trust his instincts above all else, and every fiber of his being was telling him that this mission was wrong. He raised his fist, signaling his team to halt and take defensive positions. The anonymous warning had been specific enough about their operational details to be credible, and Morrison wasn't willing to risk the lives of his men on what might be faulty intelligence. The SEAL team's sudden change in formation probably saved their lives. Less than 30 seconds after they took cover, the compound erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit up windows and doorways that intelligence reports had claimed were empty. The precision of the ambush was terrifying. Enemy fighters were positioned exactly where they would have had clear shots at the team's planned approach route. Someone had given them detailed information about American tactics and positioning. Lena's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Marcus Chen. The SEAL team had received her warning and taken defensive action, but they were now pinned down by superior numbers in unfamiliar territory. The situation had gone from bad to worse, and Marcus was asking for any additional intelligence she might have about enemy positions or escape routes. The problem was that Lena's access to real-time battlefield information was limited, and she was already pushing the boundaries of what she could do without triggering security protocols. Back in the compound, Morrison's team was fighting for their lives against an enemy that seemed to know their every move. The attackers had set up crossfire positions that covered all the obvious escape routes, and their communications were being jammed by sophisticated equipment that shouldn't have been available to local insurgents. This wasn't a random encounter or even a well-planned ambush based on general intelligence. This was a trap designed specifically for American Special Operations Forces. Lena knew she had to dig deeper into the compromised communications if she was going to help the trapped SEAL team. She also knew that doing so would expose her activities to anyone monitoring the systems. Her illegal access to military networks was already a federal crime that could land her in prison for decades. But 8 American soldiers were fighting for their lives because someone in their own government was betraying them. And Lena couldn't live with herself if she didn't do everything possible to help. The data she needed was buried in classified communication logs that required her to access multiple military databases simultaneously. Each system she penetrated increased the risk of detection, but it also brought her closer to understanding the scope of the betrayal. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The compromised communications weren't limited to this single mission. Someone had been systematically providing operational details about American forces to enemy fighters for at least 6 months. Morrison's radio crackled with an incoming transmission on the emergency frequency. The voice was digitally distorted, but the message was clear. Enemy reinforcements were approaching from the east, and the team had approximately 10 minutes to break contact before they would be completely surrounded. The transmission also included specific recommendations for an alternative extraction route that avoided the most heavily defended positions. Morrison had no idea who was providing this information, but it was proving more accurate than anything in his official briefing. Lena's fingers flew across multiple keyboards as she coordinated information from various sources. She had managed to establish a secure communication link with Marcus, who was relaying her intelligence to the SEAL team through military contractors in the region, but maintaining this connection required her to stay active in systems where she was increasingly likely to be detected. She could already see traces of security sweeps beginning to close in on her digital signatures. The breakthrough came when Lena identified a pattern in the timing of the compromised communications. Every leaked piece of operational intelligence had been accessed within hours of being uploaded to a specific military database. More importantly, the access logs showed that only 3 individuals had the necessary clearance and computer access to retrieve all of the compromised information. One of those 3 people was actively betraying American forces to the enemy. Morrison's team began their fighting withdrawal, using the alternative route provided by their unknown benefactor. The path led them through a series of irrigation ditches and abandoned buildings that offered cover from enemy fire, while avoiding the prepared ambush positions. Whoever was guiding them had intimate knowledge of both the local terrain and enemy tactics. The guidance was so precise that Morrison began to suspect their mysterious ally had access to real-time surveillance of the battlefield. Lena's investigation into the 3 suspects revealed disturbing information about each of them. Colonel Richard Hayes was a decorated intelligence officer with gambling debts that exceeded his annual salary. Major Sarah Williams had recently gone through an expensive divorce and was facing financial difficulties. Captain David Park had family members living in countries that were not friendly to American interests. Any of them could have been motivated to betray their country, but Lena needed proof before she could make accusations. The proof came from an unexpected source. While analyzing communication patterns, Lena discovered that one of the suspects had been accessing classified databases from locations that didn't match their official duty assignments. The access logs showed someone using Colonel Hayes' credentials to retrieve mission details, while Hayes was supposedly attending meetings hundreds of miles away. Either someone was using his stolen credentials, or Hayes was lying about his whereabouts. Morrison's team reached a temporary safe position, but their situation remained critical. They were still deep in enemy territory with limited ammunition and no immediate prospect of extraction. Their official communication channels had been compromised, and they couldn't trust any information coming through normal military networks. They were entirely dependent on guidance from their unknown ally, a person who seemed to know more about their situation than their own command structure. Lena made the decision to risk everything on a single gambit. She sent Marcus detailed information about Colonel Hayes' suspicious activities, along with enough evidence to suggest that he was the source of the security breaches. She also provided specific recommendations for alternative communication protocols that the SEAL team could use to coordinate their extraction without risking further compromise. But sending this information required her to access the most secure military databases, virtually guaranteeing that her activities would be detected. The response came faster than Lena had expected. Within minutes of sending her message, she detected multiple security traces converging on her location. Federal agents were almost certainly on their way to her apartment, and her computer systems would be seized as evidence. But she had accomplished her primary objective. The SEAL team now had the information they needed to survive, and the military had enough evidence to begin investigating Colonel Hayes. Morrison received the final transmission just as his team prepared for their extraction attempt. The message contained detailed information about Hayes' betrayal and instructions for using secure communication protocols that hadn't been compromised. More importantly, it included real-time intelligence about enemy positions that would allow the team to avoid the remaining ambush sites. The message ended with a simple signature: Lena Gray sends her regards. As federal agents surrounded her Detroit apartment building, Lena calmly destroyed the last of her equipment and prepared for arrest. She had saved 8 American lives and exposed a traitor who might have caused countless more deaths. Whether she would live to see justice done remained to be seen, but she had no regrets about the choices she had made. In the distance, she could hear the sound of approaching helicopters, both the law enforcement units coming for her and the military aircraft that would hopefully carry Morrison's team to safety. The FBI agents who arrested Lena Gray found her sitting calmly at her kitchen table, hands visible, making no attempt to resist or flee. Special Agent Rebecca Torres had been expecting to find a desperate fugitive. not a composed woman who seemed almost relieved that her ordeal was finally over. Lena's apartment was a maze of sophisticated computer equipment that looked more like a government intelligence facility than the home of an unemployed former soldier. Torres had read Lena's file during the drive to Detroit, discharged from Army intelligence under controversial circumstances, no current security clearance, officially banned from accessing military networks. Yet somehow this woman had penetrated some of the most secure databases in the American military and potentially saved the lives of an entire SEAL team. The contradiction between Lena's official status and her apparent capabilities was puzzling, and Torres suspected there was much more to this story than the initial reports suggested. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, Morrison's team was finally safe aboard an extraction helicopter, but the lieutenant commander couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious woman who had saved their lives. Military intelligence had confirmed that Colonel Hayes was indeed the source of the security breaches, and that his betrayal had endangered multiple operations over the past several months. But how had a disgraced former analyst managed to uncover a conspiracy that had escaped the attention of the entire military intelligence apparatus? Lena's interrogation began in a sterile federal building in downtown Detroit. Agent Torres led the questioning, trying to understand how someone without official access had managed to penetrate military networks that were supposed to be impregnable. Lena was cooperative but careful, providing enough information to demonstrate her innocence regarding the espionage charges while avoiding details that might implicate others who had helped her. The legal situation was complicated by the fact that Lena's illegal activities had exposed legitimate national security threats. Her unauthorized access to classified systems was clearly a federal crime, but her actions had also prevented what might have been a massacre of American forces. The Justice Department was struggling to decide whether to prosecute her as a criminal or recruit her as an asset. During her first day in federal custody, Lena learned more about the scope of Colonel Hayes's betrayal. The intelligence he had provided to enemy forces had resulted in the deaths of at least 12 American service members over the past 6 months. Several missions had failed under suspicious circumstances, and multiple safe houses had been compromised with deadly results. Hayes had been systematically trading American lives for money, and Lena's investigation had finally exposed his activities. Agent Torres found herself increasingly impressed by Lena's analytical capabilities as the interrogation continued. Despite having no official access to current intelligence, Lena had managed to piece together a complex pattern of betrayal using only fragments of information she had gleaned from various sources. Her methods were unorthodox and technically illegal, but her results were undeniably effective. The breakthrough in Lena's case came when Morrison's SEAL team submitted their official after-action report. The lieutenant commander went to extraordinary lengths to document how Lena's warnings had saved their lives, and he formally requested that the military recognize her contributions despite her unofficial status. Morrison's testimony carried significant weight within the special operations community, and his endorsement began to shift official opinion about Lena's activities. Lena's background investigation revealed why she had been discharged from Army intelligence, and the details cast her current situation in a new light. 3 years earlier, she had identified serious security vulnerabilities in military communication systems and had reported them through official channels. When her warnings were ignored and subsequently exploited by enemy forces, Lena had attempted to address the problems herself. Her unauthorized efforts to fix the security issues had been discovered and misinterpreted as potential espionage, leading to her discharge and the revocation of her security clearance. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Agent Torres. Lena had been punished for trying to protect military communications, and now she was being prosecuted for using those same communication systems to save American lives. The pattern suggested that Lena had been consistently ahead of the curve in identifying security threats, but that the military bureaucracy had been too rigid to appreciate her unconventional approaches. Colonel Hayes's arrest sent shockwaves through the military intelligence community. He had been a respected officer with an exemplary service record, and his betrayal raised uncomfortable questions about internal security protocols. The investigation into his activities revealed that he had been recruited by foreign agents 2 years earlier, initially providing minor intelligence in exchange for money to cover his gambling debts. The arrangement had gradually escalated until he was providing detailed operational plans that directly endangered American forces. Lena's knowledge of the Hayes investigation proved more extensive than anyone had realized. During her interrogation, she provided details about his activities that hadn't been discovered through official channels. She had identified patterns in compromised operations that pointed to Hayes months before his arrest, but her warnings had been dismissed because of her unofficial status. Once again, the military had ignored intelligence from Lena Gray at their own peril. The case took another turn when Marcus Chen voluntarily surrendered to federal authorities. The former CIA operative explained his role in facilitating communication between Lena and Morrison's SEAL team, and he provided additional evidence about the scope of the security breaches. Chen's testimony confirmed that Lena had been working alone to expose the conspiracy, and that her motivations were purely patriotic rather than personal or financial. Agent Torres began to understand that Lena Gray represented a unique type of intelligence asset. Her analytical skills were exceptional, her understanding of military communication systems was comprehensive, and her dedication to protecting American forces was unquestionable. The problem was that her methods operated outside normal legal and bureaucratic constraints, making her simultaneously invaluable and impossible to control through traditional channels. The military's internal investigation revealed that Lena's warnings about security vulnerabilities 3 years earlier had been accurate and prescient. The same weaknesses she had identified had indeed been exploited by enemy forces, resulting in the compromise of multiple operations. Her discharge had been based on fears about her unauthorized activities rather than evidence of actual wrongdoing, and the military had essentially punished her for being right about threats they hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Morrison's team returned to the United States as heroes, but the lieutenant commander made it clear that their survival had depended entirely on intelligence provided by Lena Gray. His public statements about her role in saving their lives generated significant media attention and put pressure on federal prosecutors to consider the broader context of her actions. The narrative of a disgraced soldier risking everything to save her former comrades resonated with the public and complicated efforts to portray her as a simple criminal. As Lena sat in her federal holding cell, she reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this point. 3 years ago, she had been a promising young intelligence analyst with a bright future ahead of her. Now she was a federal prisoner facing potentially decades in prison for crimes she had committed while trying to save American lives. But she had no regrets about her choices. 8 men were alive because of her actions, and a traitor had been exposed before he could cause more damage. The question now was whether the American government would recognize Lena Gray as a patriot who had sacrificed everything for her country, or prosecute her as a criminal who had violated the law regardless of her motivations. The answer would determine not only her future, but also whether other potential whistleblowers would be encouraged or deterred from exposing similar threats to national security. The federal courthouse in Detroit became the center of a media storm. As Lena Gray's case moved toward trial, protesters gathered daily outside the building, some demanding her prosecution as a cyber terrorist, others calling for her recognition as a patriotic whistleblower. The case had divided public opinion and created an uncomfortable situation for government prosecutors who were trying to balance national security concerns with political realities. Defense attorney Michael Rodriguez had taken Lena's case pro bono after reading about her situation in the news. A former military lawyer himself, Rodriguez understood the complexities of national security law and the challenges facing someone who operated outside official channels to protect American interests. He also recognized that Lena's case could set important precedents about the rights and responsibilities of intelligence professionals who discovered government wrongdoing. Agent Torres found herself in an increasingly awkward position as the lead investigator on Lena's case. Every piece of evidence she uncovered seemed to support Lena's claims about trying to protect American forces rather than harm them. The deeper Torres dug into the background of the case, the more convinced she became that Lena had been consistently right about security threats that the official intelligence community had either missed or ignored. The prosecution's case was built around the undeniable fact that Lena had illegally accessed classified military databases without authorization. Federal prosecutor David Walsh argued that her motivations were irrelevant, and that allowing civilians to decide which laws to follow based on their personal judgments would undermine the entire structure of government secrecy. The law was clear, Walsh insisted, and Lena had broken it regardless of the consequences. Rodriguez's defense strategy focused on establishing the context for Lena's actions and demonstrating that she had exhausted official channels before resorting to illegal methods. He planned to show that the military's rejection of her security warnings 3 years earlier had directly contributed to the current crisis, and that her unofficial investigation had been the only way to prevent additional American casualties. The trial took an unexpected turn when Morrison himself requested permission to testify on Lena's behalf. The Navy initially refused to allow an active-duty SEAL officer to appear in a civilian court case involving classified information, but Morrison's persistence and the high-profile nature of the case eventually forced military leadership to reconsider. His testimony would be heavily restricted and monitored, but the court would hear from the man whose life Lena had saved. Morrison's appearance in court was dramatic and emotional. Still wearing his dress uniform with ribbons representing multiple combat deployments, he described in careful detail how Lena's warnings had prevented what would have been a catastrophic ambush. He testified that his team had survived solely because of intelligence provided by the defendant, and that her actions had demonstrated the highest levels of courage and patriotism. The government's case suffered another setback when details of Colonel Hayes's plea agreement became public. Hayes had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his revelations about the scope of his betrayal were devastating. He admitted to providing operational intelligence that had resulted in the deaths of American service members, and he confirmed that Lena's investigation had been accurate in all its major conclusions. Lena's decision to testify in her own defense surprised both the prosecution and her own attorney. Against Rodriguez's advice, she insisted on taking the stand to explain her actions in her own words. Her testimony was measured and precise, demonstrating the analytical skills that had made her such an effective intelligence professional. She acknowledged breaking the law but explained that she had faced an impossible choice between legal compliance and moral responsibility. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Walsh tried to portray Lena as a rogue operator who had appointed herself judge and jury over matters of national security. He questioned her right to make decisions that had been entrusted to elected officials and military commanders, and he suggested that her actions could encourage other unauthorized activities that might genuinely threaten American interests. Lena's response was straightforward and compelling. She explained that she had initially tried to work within official channels, only to see her warnings ignored while American forces continued to die. She testified that her illegal activities had been limited in scope and focused entirely on protecting military personnel who were being betrayed by someone within their own command structure. She admitted that her methods were wrong but insisted that her goals had been entirely patriotic. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Agent Torres was called as a prosecution witness but ended up providing testimony that seemed to support the defense. Under oath, Torres acknowledged that her investigation had confirmed the accuracy of Lena's analysis and the effectiveness of her methods. She also admitted that official intelligence channels had failed to identify the security breaches that Lena had discovered through her unauthorized investigation. Rodriguez used Torres's testimony to argue that Lena's illegal activities had been more effective at protecting national security than the legal activities of the entire military intelligence establishment. He suggested that prosecuting her would send a message that the government valued bureaucratic compliance more than actual results, potentially discouraging other intelligence professionals from reporting genuine security threats. The character testimony phase of the trial brought forward a parade of former colleagues and military officers who vouched for Lena's patriotism and competence. Many testified that she had been one of the most promising analysts of her generation, and that her discharge from the Army had been a significant loss for the intelligence community. Several witnesses suggested that her unconventional methods were actually strengths rather than weaknesses in an environment where traditional approaches had proven inadequate. The prosecution struggled to find witnesses who would testify against Lena's character or question her motivations. Even military officials who disapproved of her methods acknowledged that her goals had been legitimate and that her results had been impressive. The government's case increasingly seemed to rest on purely legal arguments rather than practical or moral considerations. Public opinion continued to shift in Lena's favor as more details about her background emerged during the trial. Media coverage highlighted her military service, her attempts to work within official channels, and the lives she had saved through her unauthorized activities. Polls showed that a majority of Americans viewed her as a hero rather than a criminal, putting additional pressure on prosecutors to consider alternatives to incarceration. The international intelligence community was also paying close attention to Lena's trial. Foreign allies were expressing concern about American security procedures, while adversaries were undoubtedly studying the case for insights into U.S. military communication systems. The trial was inadvertently providing a public education about intelligence methods and vulnerabilities that made some officials uncomfortable. Behind the scenes, military leadership was conducting a comprehensive review of security protocols in response to the Hayes scandal and Lena's revelations. The review had identified numerous weaknesses in existing systems and had led to significant changes in how classified information was handled and monitored. In many ways, Lena's unauthorized investigation had forced improvements that official oversight had failed to achieve. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides prepared for closing arguments that would frame the fundamental question at the heart of the case. Was Lena Gray a criminal who had violated the law and endangered national security, or was she a patriot who had risked everything to protect American lives when official channels had failed? The jury's answer would not only determine her fate, but also establish important precedents about the balance between legal compliance and moral responsibility in matters of national security. The jury deliberated for 3 days, a length of time that made both legal teams nervous about the final verdict. During those 72 hours, Lena remained in federal custody while the nation debated her case on social media, news programs, and editorial pages. Public demonstrations supporting her had grown larger and more organized, with military veterans prominently featured among her supporters. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was overwhelming. Judge Patricia Hamilton had presided over hundreds of federal cases during her career, but she had rarely seen a trial that generated such intense public interest or raised such fundamental questions about the nature of patriotism and legal obligation. The verdict would send a message that extended far beyond the fate of one former intelligence analyst. The jury foreman, a retired engineer named Robert Chen, stood to deliver the verdict with obvious emotion in his voice. On the charge of unauthorized access to classified computer systems, we find the defendant guilty, he announced, causing Lena's supporters in the courtroom to gasp in dismay. But Chen continued, "However, we unanimously recommend mercy and commutation of any sentence based on the extraordinary circumstances of this case and the defendant's clear intent to protect American lives." Judge Hamilton thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following month, explaining that she needed time to consider the complex legal and moral issues raised by the case. Lena's conviction was technically a victory for the prosecution, but the jury's recommendation for mercy had clearly undermined the government's position that she deserved significant punishment for her actions. Rodriguez immediately announced plans to appeal the conviction while also preparing for the sentencing hearing. He argued that the jury's recommendation demonstrated their understanding that Lena's actions had been justified by circumstances that the law had not anticipated. He also pointed out that her conviction had been based purely on technical violations, rather than any intent to harm American interests. The media reaction to the verdict was mixed, with legal experts debating whether the jury had found an appropriate middle ground or had simply avoided making a difficult decision. Some commentators praised the jury for recognizing both the illegality of Lena's actions and the nobility of her motivations, while others criticized the verdict as a confusing compromise that failed to provide clear guidance for future cases. In the weeks leading up to her sentencing hearing, Lena received thousands of letters from military personnel, veterans, and ordinary citizens expressing support for her actions. Many of the letters came from service members who described their own experiences with bureaucratic failures that had endangered lives or compromised missions. Their stories painted a picture of a military culture that often prioritized following procedures over achieving results. The Department of Defense conducted its own internal review of Lena's case and concluded that significant reforms were needed to prevent similar situations in the future. The review recommended new procedures for reporting security concerns, improved oversight of classified information access, and better protection for whistleblowers who identified genuine threats to national security. Many of these recommendations directly addressed problems that Lena had identified years earlier. Morrison and his SEAL team submitted a formal petition requesting clemency for Lena, citing her role in saving their lives and exposing Colonel Hayes' betrayal. The petition was signed by over 200 special operations personnel and was delivered directly to the White House along with a request for presidential intervention in the case. The petition described Lena as a true American hero who had sacrificed her freedom to protect military personnel. Agent Torres submitted her own report recommending a suspended sentence for Lena, arguing that incarceration would serve no useful purpose and might actually harm national security by discouraging other intelligence professionals from reporting legitimate concerns. Torres had spent months investigating the case and had concluded that Lena represented exactly the kind of dedicated analyst that the intelligence community needed to protect American interests. The sentencing hearing drew even larger crowds than the trial itself, with hundreds of supporters gathering outside the courthouse to demonstrate on Lena's behalf. Military veterans in dress uniform formed honor guards along the sidewalks, while active duty personnel who had received permission to attend watched from the courtroom gallery. The scene resembled a ceremony honoring a war hero, rather than a criminal sentencing. Rodriguez presented an extensive mitigation case that included testimony from dozens of character witnesses and detailed documentation of Lena's positive contributions to national security. He argued that her conviction was punishment enough for her technical violations of the law, and that imprisoning her would send a dangerous message to other intelligence professionals who might discover similar threats in the future. Prosecutor Walsh remained adamant that Lena deserved significant prison time as a deterrent to others who might consider taking the law into their own hands. He argued that her actions, however well-intentioned, had undermined the authority of legitimate government institutions and could encourage more serious breaches of national security if they went unpunished. Lena herself requested permission to address the court before sentencing, and her statement was brief but powerful. She acknowledged her guilt and expressed regret for breaking the law, but she also made it clear that she would make the same choices again if faced with similar circumstances. "I took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States," she said, "and I believe that oath includes protecting the lives of American service members who depend on accurate intelligence." Judge Hamilton's sentencing decision reflected the complexity of the case and the unusual circumstances surrounding it. She sentenced Lena to 2 years in federal prison, but immediately suspended the sentence subject to 3 years of supervised probation and 1,000 hours of community service. The judge explained that while Lena's actions clearly violated federal law, her motivations and results justified exceptional consideration. The suspended sentence was widely viewed as a victory for Lena and her supporters, but it also created an unusual legal precedent that would influence similar cases in the future. Legal scholars debated whether Hamilton's decision represented wise judicial discretion or inappropriate sympathy for a defendant whose celebrity status had influenced the proceedings. More importantly, Lena's case had forced a national conversation about the balance between security and transparency in government operations. Her conviction established that unauthorized access to classified systems remained illegal, regardless of motivation, but her suspended sentence acknowledged that exceptional circumstances might justify extraordinary actions. The intelligence community began implementing reforms designed to prevent situations like the one that had led to Lena's prosecution. New whistleblower protection procedures were established, security oversight was strengthened, and communication protocols were updated to address the vulnerabilities that Lena had identified. In many ways, her illegal investigation had forced improvements that official channels had failed to achieve. Lena walked out of the courthouse a free woman, surrounded by supporters who cheered her suspended sentence as a vindication of her actions. But her legal troubles were far from over, as federal prosecutors had indicated they might appeal the sentence as too lenient. She also faced the challenge of rebuilding her life. and career after years of legal uncertainty and public scrutiny that the question of what Lena Gray would do next remained unanswered as she disappeared into the crowd of supporters outside the courthouse. Her case had made her a national figure and had demonstrated her exceptional skills as an intelligence analyst, but it had also confirmed her status as someone who operated outside normal legal and bureaucratic constraints. Whether the government would find a way to harness her talents or continue to view her as a threat remained to be seen. 3 months after her sentencing, Lena Gray found herself in an unexpected position. Living in a small apartment outside Washington, D.C. under the terms of her probation, she discovered that her notoriety had made her simultaneously unemployable in traditional intelligence work and highly sought after by private security firms. Her probation officer, a former FBI agent named Sarah Mitchell, had become an unlikely advocate for helping Lena find meaningful work that would allow her to contribute to national security without violating the terms of her conviction. The private sector interest in Lena's services created a new set of legal and ethical complications. Several defense contractors had approached her with lucrative offers to consult on cybersecurity and intelligence analysis, but her federal conviction and ongoing probation made it unclear whether she could legally accept such positions. The government agencies that had once viewed her as a threat were now struggling to determine whether her expertise could be useful within legal boundaries. Morrison, now promoted to commander after his successful mission in Afghanistan, had not forgotten about the woman who saved his team. He had been quietly working within military channels to find a way to bring Lena back into official service, arguing that her skills were too valuable to waste because of bureaucratic concerns. His efforts had gained support from other special operations leaders who understood the importance of having analysts who could think outside conventional parameters. Agent Torres had been reassigned to a counterintelligence unit where her experience with the Lena Gray case had made her an expert on insider threats and security vulnerabilities. She often found herself briefing other agents about the importance of taking unconventional warnings seriously, using Lena's successful identification of Colonel Hayes as an example of how traditional oversight mechanisms could miss significant threats. The reforms implemented in response to Lena's case were beginning to show results across the intelligence community. New whistleblower protection procedures had already led to the reporting of several potential security breaches that might otherwise have gone undetected. The improved oversight systems had identified additional cases of unauthorized access to classified information, some of which appeared to be legitimate security concerns rather than espionage activities. Lena's community service requirement had been structured to take advantage of her analytical skills while keeping her away from classified information. She was assigned to work with a nonprofit organization that provided cybersecurity training to small businesses and local government agencies. The work was far less challenging than her previous intelligence analysis, but it allowed her to use her technical skills to help protect civilian infrastructure from cyber attacks. The appeal of Lena's sentence had been withdrawn by federal prosecutors after the Department of Justice concluded that pursuing the case further would serve no useful purpose. The suspended sentence had achieved the government's goal of establishing that unauthorized access to classified systems would be prosecuted, while the community service requirement demonstrated that even well-intentioned violations would carry significant consequences. Marcus Chen had also received a suspended sentence for his role in facilitating communication between Lena and Morrison's team, but his punishment included a ban on any future work involving classified information. The former CIA operative had used his enforced retirement to write a book about his experiences in intelligence work, though government censors had required extensive redactions before the manuscript could be published. 6 months into her probation, Lena received an unexpected visitor at her apartment. Deputy Director Jennifer Walsh of the CIA's Directorate of Analysis had come to discuss a highly unusual proposition. The agency was facing a crisis of credibility following several high-profile intelligence failures, and Walsh believed that Lena's unconventional approach to analysis might help address some of their systemic problems. Walsh's proposal was carefully constructed to avoid any legal complications. With Lena's probation or conviction, the CIA wanted to establish an external advisory panel of intelligence professionals who could review analytical conclusions and identify potential blind spots or biases. The panel would have no access to classified information, but would be provided with sanitized summaries of intelligence problems for independent analysis. The offer was tempting for several reasons. It would allow Lena to return to meaningful intelligence work without violating the terms of her conviction, and it would provide the CIA with access to analytical perspectives that might not emerge through traditional channels. The position would also carry sufficient prestige to rehabilitate Lena's professional reputation and demonstrate that the government valued her contributions despite her legal troubles. Lena requested time to consider the offer and consulted with her attorney, her probation officer, and several trusted friends about the implications of accepting the position. Rodriguez was enthusiastic about the opportunity, viewing it as vindication of his argument that Lena's skills were too valuable to waste. Mitchell was more cautious, concerned that any association with intelligence work might create new legal risks for Lena. The decision became more complicated when similar offers arrived from other government agencies and private organizations. The Defense Intelligence Agency wanted Lena to participate in a study of analytical methodologies, while several think tanks offered research positions that would allow her to publish papers on intelligence and security issues. Each opportunity represented a different path toward rehabilitating her career and reputation. Morrison's efforts to bring Lena back into official military service had finally gained traction with senior Pentagon leadership. A new program was being developed to create civilian advisory positions for former intelligence personnel who could provide specialized expertise without requiring security clearances. The program was designed specifically to address cases like Lena's, where valuable analysts had been lost to the intelligence community due to legal or administrative complications. The public attention surrounding Lena's case had also attracted interest from academic institutions. Several universities had offered her positions as a lecturer or researcher in their international relations or cybersecurity programs. These academic opportunities would allow her to share her expertise with the next generation of intelligence professionals while conducting research that might contribute to national security without involving classified information. Lena's decision was influenced by a conversation with Agent Torres, who had become an unexpected friend during the months following the trial. Torres encouraged Lena to accept the CIA advisory position, arguing that it represented the best opportunity to contribute to national security while staying within legal boundaries. The position would also demonstrate that the intelligence community had learned from the mistakes that led to her prosecution. After weeks of deliberation, Lena accepted the CIA's offer to join their external advisory panel. The announcement generated significant media attention and was viewed as a sign that the intelligence community was serious about implementing reforms and embracing new analytical approaches. Her appointment was also seen as recognition that her prosecution had been based on technical legal violations rather than genuine concerns about her loyalty or competence. The first meeting of the advisory panel took place in a nondescript office building in suburban Virginia, far from the CIA's headquarters at Langley. Lena found herself working alongside other former intelligence professionals who had been recruited for their diverse perspectives and unconventional approaches to analysis. The group's first assignment was to review a series of analytical failures and identify the systemic factors that had contributed to incorrect conclusions. Lena's analysis of the case studies immediately identified patterns that reminded her of the security vulnerabilities she had discovered years earlier. The same bureaucratic rigidity and resistance to unconventional thinking that had led to her discharge from the Army were evident in the analytical failures being reviewed by the panel. Her recommendations for addressing these problems drew heavily on her experience with the Hayes investigation and her understanding of how institutional biases could obscure important intelligence. The success of the advisory panel's initial work led to expanded responsibilities and additional resources. Lena found herself effectively serving as an unofficial consultant to the intelligence community, providing insights and recommendations that helped address some of the analytical challenges that had contributed to recent failures. Her rehabilitation was nearly complete, but questions remained about whether her unconventional methods could be successfully integrated into traditional intelligence operations without creating new legal or security risks. 2 years after her conviction, Lena Gray had become one of the most influential voices in American intelligence reform, despite never again having access to classified information. Her work with the CIA Advisory Panel had led to significant changes in analytical procedures across multiple agencies, and her insights had helped prevent several potential intelligence failures. The woman who had once been prosecuted as a criminal was now being consulted by the highest levels of government on matters of national security. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Lena's probation had ended successfully, but the felony conviction remained on her record as a permanent reminder of her legal troubles. She had learned to navigate the complex world of intelligence consulting, where her expertise was valued, but her methods remained controversial. Some officials still viewed her as a dangerous maverick who couldn't be trusted to work within established systems. Commander Morrison had finally achieved his goal of bringing Lena back into official military service, though not in the way he had originally envisioned. The Pentagon had created a new civilian position specifically for her, serving as a special advisor on analytical methodology and security vulnerabilities. The position allowed her to work directly with military intelligence units while maintaining her civilian status and avoiding the legal complications that would have accompanied a return to uniformed service. Agent Torres had been promoted to Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, where she had implemented new protocols for investigating potential insider threats. Her experience with the Hayes case and the Lena Gray investigation had made her an expert on identifying the warning signs of espionage and the importance of taking unconventional intelligence sources seriously. She often cited Lena's work as an example of how valuable insights could come from unexpected places. The intelligence community had grudgingly acknowledged that Lena's unconventional methods produced results that traditional approaches often missed. Her ability to identify patterns in complex datasets and her willingness to pursue leads that others dismissed had led to the discovery of additional security breaches and the prevention of several potential attacks. The challenge was finding ways to harness these capabilities within legal and bureaucratic frameworks that had not been designed for someone like her. Lena's work had also attracted international attention, with allied intelligence services seeking her consultation on their own analytical challenges. The British, Canadian, and Australian intelligence communities had all requested briefings on her methods and findings, recognizing that the problems she had identified in American systems likely existed in their organizations as well. Her insights were helping to drive reforms across the Five Eyes intelligence alliance. The Hayes case had continued to reverberate through the intelligence community long after the colonel's conviction and imprisonment. His betrayal had exposed systemic weaknesses in security oversight that extended far beyond the specific information he had provided to enemy forces. Subsequent investigations had revealed that dozens of other personnel had similar vulnerabilities that could have been exploited by foreign intelligence services. Lena's role in exposing the Hayes conspiracy had made her a target for foreign intelligence services who viewed her as a significant threat to their operations. FBI counterintelligence agents had briefed her on several attempts by hostile nations to either recruit her or neutralize her effectiveness through intimidation or disinformation. The irony that foreign governments now considered her a more significant threat than her own government had once did was not lost on Lena. The academic work that Lena had undertaken alongside her government consulting had produced several influential papers on intelligence analysis and cybersecurity. Her research had been published in prestigious journals and had become required reading at military academies and intelligence training schools. She had effectively become a recognized expert in fields that she had been banned from working in just a few years earlier. Morrison's SEAL team had remained in contact with Lena throughout her legal troubles and professional rehabilitation. Several team members had testified at congressional hearings about intelligence reform, consistently emphasizing how Lena's warnings had saved their lives and how traditional intelligence channels had failed them. Their advocacy had been instrumental in changing official attitudes about the value of unconventional analytical approaches. The nonprofit cybersecurity work that Lena had begun during her community service had evolved into a major initiative that was protecting critical infrastructure across the country. Her techniques for identifying vulnerabilities in civilian systems had proven remarkably effective, and her organization had been credited with preventing several potential cyber attacks on power grids, water treatment facilities, and financial networks. 3 years after her sentencing, Lena received a phone call that she had never expected. The president's national security advisor was requesting a private meeting to discuss her potential appointment to a senior position in the intelligence community. The conversation was carefully framed as an informal discussion rather than a job offer, but the implications were clear. The highest levels of government were considering bringing her back into official service. The meeting took place in the White House Situation Room, a location that Lena had never imagined she would see after her conviction. The National Security Advisor explained that the president had been following her work with interest and believed that her unique perspectives and proven track record justified offering her a senior advisory role with access to the nation's most sensitive intelligence. The position would require Senate confirmation and would represent a complete rehabilitation of her professional status. The offer was both an opportunity and a dilemma for Lena. Accepting would provide her with the resources and access necessary to make significant contributions to national security, but it would also return her to the same bureaucratic environment that had rejected her warnings and prosecuted her for trying to protect American lives. She wondered whether the system had truly changed, or whether she would once again find herself fighting institutional resistance to necessary reforms. Lena requested time to consider the offer and consulted with the people who had supported her throughout her ordeal. Rodriguez encouraged her to accept, viewing it as complete vindication of his defense strategy. Torres was more cautious, warning that senior government positions came with political pressures that might compromise Lena's ability to speak truth to power. Morrison was enthusiastic, arguing that she could accomplish more from inside the system than from her current position as an external advisor. After careful consideration, Lena accepted the position with one significant condition. She insisted on a written guarantee that she would be protected from retaliation if her analysis conflicted with official policy preferences, or if she identified problems that senior officials preferred to ignore. The condition was unusual for a political appointment, but the White House agreed, recognizing that Lena's value lay precisely in her willingness to challenge conventional thinking. The Senate confirmation hearings for Lena's appointment generated significant media attention and political debate. Some senators questioned whether someone with a felony conviction should hold a senior intelligence position, while others argued that her prosecution had been unjustified and that her subsequent contributions demonstrated her value to national security. The hearings provided a public forum for relitigating the fundamental questions about loyalty, legality, and moral responsibility that had defined her case. Lena's confirmation was ultimately approved by a narrow margin, with support coming primarily from senators who viewed her as a reformer who could help address the intelligence failures that had plagued recent administrations. Her appointment sent a clear signal that the government was serious about embracing new approaches to intelligence analysis and was willing to overlook past legal troubles in favor of proven competence. On her first day in her new position, Lena stood in her Pentagon office looking out at the same Washington skyline she had once observed from her Detroit apartment while conducting her unauthorized investigation. The journey from disgraced former analyst to senior government official had been longer and more difficult than she could have imagined, but it had also demonstrated that the American system could eventually recognize and reward those who sacrificed everything to protect their fellow citizens. The story of Lena Gray had become a legend within the intelligence community, inspiring a new generation of analysts to pursue truth and protect American lives regardless of bureaucratic obstacles. Her case had proven that one person with courage and determination could make a difference, even when operating outside traditional channels and facing the full weight of government prosecution. As she began her new role, Lena remained committed to the same principles that had driven her to risk everything to save 8 Navy SEALs in a distant Afghan compound. The bullet that had started her journey was now just a memory, but the moment of clarity it represented continued to guide her work in service of her country.